Today's topic is sensitive, so I want to begin with respect for both Islam and Hinduism. The goal here is not to criticize, but to understand two very different theological perspectives. Many people ask, why does Allah punish a person with hell for worshipping someone else? Doesn't that seem egoistic? And on the other hand, why is Bhagwan often described as large-hearted and accepting many paths? To understand this, we first need to understand how God is defined in Islam. In Islam, Allah is described in the Quran as absolutely one, a concept called Tawheed. The Quran emphasizes this strongly, especially in Quran Surah Al-Ikhlas. He is Allah, one. Associating partners with Allah is called Shirk, and it is considered the gravest sin, because it contradicts the very foundation of Islamic belief. From the Islamic perspective, this is not about ego. Allah in Islam is not seen as needing worship. In fact, Allah is described as Al-Ghani, the self-sufficient. Worship is considered beneficial for humans, not for God. According to Islamic theology, worshipping something created instead of the Creator is seen as a fundamental misalignment with truth, like mistaking a shadow for the source of light. Now let's look at Hindu philosophy. When discussing whether Allah appears egoistic or Bhagwan appears large-hearted, the most important starting point is understanding that Islam and Hinduism define God in fundamentally different ways. Without first recognizing this difference in definition, any comparison can easily become misleading. The question is not simply about behavior. It is about the very nature of the divine in each tradition. In Islam, the concept of God is built upon absolute oneness, known as Tawheed. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes that Allah is one, unique, incomparable, and without partners. Allah is not part of creation, does not manifest within creation, and does not share divinity with anything or anyone. There is a complete and eternal distinction between the Creator and the created. Because of this, worship in Islam is exclusive by definition. Directing worship toward anything created, whether a person, idol, prophet, or natural force, is considered a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. From this theological foundation, associating partners with Allah is not viewed as a minor mistake, but as a contradiction of the core truth about existence. In contrast, many Hindu traditions describe the divine in a way that is more expansive and layered. The Bhagavad Gita presents a vision in which the Supreme Being can be approached in multiple ways. Bhagwan may be understood as personal, impersonal, with form, or beyond form. Different deities are often seen as manifestations or expressions of one ultimate reality known as Brahman. In this framework, worshipping different forms is not necessarily seen as worshipping separate gods in competition, but as approaching the same ultimate truth through different symbols, personalities, and paths. Diversity in devotion does not automatically imply disloyalty to the Supreme, because multiplicity itself is woven into the theological structure. These two perspectives operate on different metaphysical assumptions. Islam emphasizes transcendence. God is utterly beyond creation. Hindu philosophy, particularly in Vedantic schools, often emphasizes immanence as well. The divine can pervade and manifest within creation. Therefore, what appears as exclusivity in one system is coherence within its own worldview, and what appears as inclusivity in another system is consistency within its own metaphysics. If one judges Islamic monotheism using a pluralistic lens, it may seem restrictive. But within Islamic theology, allowing worship of others would contradict the very definition of God's oneness. Similarly, if one judges Hindu pluralism using a strictly monotheistic lens, it may seem inconsistent. Yet within Hindu philosophy, multiplicity can be an expression of unity rather than a denial of it. Understanding these foundational differences shifts the discussion away from emotional labels like egoistic or large-hearted. Instead, It highlights that each tradition is internally consistent according to its own definition of the divine. Before evaluating fairness or severity, one must first understand how each religion defines who God is. In Islam, the concept of Tawheed, or absolute monotheism, is the foundation upon which the entire faith is built. It is not simply one belief among many. It is the central pillar that defines a Muslim's understanding of reality, purpose, morality, and salvation. The declaration of faith itself, that there is no God but Allah, reflects this uncompromising emphasis on divine unity. The Quran consistently affirms that Allah is one, without partner, without equal, and without division. This oneness is not numerical in a simple sense, but absolute in essence, authority, and worship. Because Tawheed is so central, anything that contradicts it is treated with utmost seriousness. In Islamic theology, associating partners with Allah, known as Shirk, is considered the gravest sin. Shirk can include worshipping idols, attributing divine qualities to human beings, believing in multiple gods, or directing acts of devotion such as prayer and sacrifice toward anyone besides Allah. The seriousness of shirk does not stem from the idea that Allah is threatened or diminished by human actions. Rather, it is understood as a distortion of the most fundamental truth about existence, that there is only one ultimate creator and sustainer of all things. Islam teaches that Allah is completely self-sufficient and independent. Human worship does not increase his power, nor does disbelief reduce it. The Quran describes Allah as free of need from his creation. From this perspective, worship is not something Allah requires. It is something humans need in order to align themselves with truth and live in accordance with their purpose. Therefore, directing worship toward created beings is seen as misplacing devotion, confusing the dependent with the independent, the finite with the infinite. The strong warnings about shirk in the Quran are often interpreted by critics as harsh or exclusionary. However, within Islamic theology, these warnings are tied to the concept of divine justice and accountability. Life is understood as a test in which humans are given intellect, guidance, and the ability to choose. Prophets are sent throughout history to clarify the message of monotheism and to call people back to the worship of the one Creator. Rejecting that message knowingly and persistently is viewed as a rejection of truth itself. Hell, in this framework, is not portrayed as a reaction of wounded pride from God. Instead, it is part of a moral order in which actions have consequences. Just as justice in human societies involves accountability, divine justice in Islam involves responsibility for one's beliefs and deeds. The severity attached to shirk reflects the belief that misunderstanding or denying the oneness of God disrupts the very foundation of moral and spiritual life. To fully understand this position, one must see Tawheed not as a narrow rule, but as the defining principle of Islamic theology. Everything else, ethics, worship, law, and spirituality, flows from this absolute affirmation of divine unity. Without grasping how central Tawheed is, the Islamic stance on worship and shirk can easily be misunderstood. In Islamic theology, the concepts of accountability and divine justice are deeply interconnected. Human life is understood as purposeful, not random. Every individual is believed to be created with awareness, moral capacity, and the ability to choose between right and wrong. The Quran presents life as a test in which human beings are entrusted with free will and guidance. This guidance comes through revelation and through prophets who convey the message of monotheism and moral responsibility. Within this framework, belief is not seen as blind submission, but as a conscious recognition of truth. The idea of hell in Islam is often interpreted emotionally, but within Islamic doctrine, it is primarily linked to justice rather than ego or anger. Allah is described as perfectly just, meaning that no soul is wronged even to the smallest degree. Every action, intention, and belief is accounted for with complete knowledge and fairness. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes that God does not punish without warning, nor does he hold someone accountable without first providing guidance. This guidance may come through scripture, prophets, reason, or the innate moral awareness that Islam teaches every human being possesses. Accountability in Islam is personal and individual. Each person stands before God responsible for their own choices. No one bears the burden of another's sins, and no one is judged unfairly based on circumstances beyond their control. Even when discussing disbelief or associating partners with Allah, Islamic scholars explain that judgment ultimately depends on knowledge, intention, and exposure to the message. Divine justice takes into account the full reality of a person's life, something only God can completely know. Hell, therefore, is understood as a consequence of persistent rejection of truth and wrongdoing, not as an expression of divine insecurity. In fact, Islamic theology strongly rejects the idea that God experiences human emotions such as jealousy or ego in the way humans do. Allah is described as beyond weakness, beyond need, and beyond emotional instability. When the Quran speaks of punishment, it frames it within moral order. Just as good actions are rewarded, harmful actions and conscious rebellion carry consequences. At the same time, Islam places immense emphasis on mercy. One of the most repeated descriptions of Allah in the Quran is the most merciful, the most compassionate. Mercy is said to precede wrath, and repentance is always open until death. A person who sincerely turns back to God, even after major sins, is promised forgiveness. This balance between justice and mercy is central to Islamic belief. Accountability ensures moral seriousness, while mercy ensures hope. From within this theological system, hell is not arbitrary. It is part of a broader structure in which moral choices matter and truth carries weight. To remove accountability would, in this view, make human freedom meaningless. Justice gives significance to belief and action, while mercy provides the opportunity for redemption. Understanding this balance is essential when evaluating the Islamic perspective on divine judgment. In many Hindu philosophical traditions, the divine is understood in a way that allows for plurality without necessarily denying unity. This theological flexibility is one of the reasons Hinduism is often described as inclusive or pluralistic. Rather than insisting on a single, exclusive form of worship, many schools of Hindu thought recognize multiple valid paths through which a person may approach the ultimate reality. The Bhagavad Gita expresses this idea beautifully when Lord Krishna explains that however people approach the divine responds to them accordingly. This verse has often been interpreted as an affirmation that spiritual diversity does not contradict ultimate unity. At the heart of much Hindu philosophy is the concept of Brahman, the ultimate, infinite reality that transcends all descriptions and limitations. Brahman is understood as formless, eternal, and beyond human comprehension. At the same time, this same ultimate reality can manifest in personal forms, such as Vishnu, Shiva Devi, or Krishna, allowing devotees to build a loving and personal relationship with the divine. This ability of the Supreme to take many forms does not necessarily imply the existence of competing gods. Rather, it suggests that the infinite can express itself in ways accessible to finite human minds. Because of this theological structure, worshipping different deities is often seen not as dividing loyalty, but as choosing a particular doorway into the same spiritual truth. A devotee of Krishna may see Krishna as the supreme, while a devotee of Shiva may see Shiva as supreme. Yet many philosophical schools hold that these are ultimately expressions of the same underlying reality. This layered understanding allows for diversity in ritual, symbolism, and devotion while maintaining a deeper unity. At the metaphysical level, Another important element of Hindu pluralism is the recognition of multiple spiritual paths, often described as yoga. The path of devotion, the path of knowledge, the path of selfless action, and the path of meditation are all seen as legitimate approaches depending on a person's temperament and stage of spiritual growth. This reinforces the idea that spiritual progress is not confined to one rigid formula. Different individuals may require different methods to reach liberation or moksha. This pluralistic outlook contributes to the perception of Bhagwan as large-hearted. The divine is not portrayed as limited to a single name, language, or ritual. Instead, the divine is seen as vast enough to accommodate varied expressions of faith. This inclusivity reflects the belief that truth is too expansive to be contained within one exclusive framework. Understanding this perspective requires recognizing that Hindu theology often embraces complexity and multiplicity as reflections of the infinite nature of reality. Unity does not eliminate diversity. Rather, diversity becomes a manifestation of unity. In this context, spiritual variety is not seen as contradiction, but as richness. One of the most significant differences between Islam and Hindu traditions lies in how each understands worship and its purpose. Worship is not merely a ritual act. It reflects how a religion defines the relationship between the human being and the divine. Because Islam and Hindu philosophy begin with different theological foundations, their views on worship naturally develop in different directions. In Islam, worship is exclusive by definition. The central declaration of faith affirms that only Allah deserves worship. The Quran consistently instructs believers to pray, seek help, and place ultimate trust in Allah alone. Acts of devotion such as prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage are directed solely toward Him. This exclusivity is directly tied to the concept of Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God. Since Allah is understood as the sole creator and sustainer, worshipping anyone or anything else is seen as directing devotion towards something that is itself dependent and created. In this framework, worship is an acknowledgement of ultimate authority and dependence. It is not only about love or reverence, but about recognizing who holds absolute power over life, death, judgment, and destiny. Therefore, worshipping another being, even out of respect or admiration, can cross into theological error if it attributes divine status to what is not divine. Islam draws a very clear boundary between honoring someone and worshipping them. Prophets, for example, are deeply respected, but they are never objects of worship. In contrast, many Hindu traditions understand worship as more flexible and diverse. The Bhagavad Gita presents devotion as one of several valid paths to spiritual realization. Worship may take the form of devotion to a personal deity, meditation on the formless absolute, ritual offerings, chanting, or selfless service. Because the divine can manifest in multiple forms, devotion directed toward a particular deity is often understood as devotion to the Supreme expressed through that form. This means that worship in Hinduism does not always carry the same exclusivist structure found in Islam. A devotee may choose one form of God as their primary focus, while still acknowledging the validity of other forms. In some philosophical schools, all deities are seen as different aspects of one underlying reality, making worship less about exclusive allegiance and more about personal spiritual connection. These differences in worship reflect deeper theological assumptions. Islam emphasizes transcendence and singularity, leading to exclusive devotion. Hindu philosophy often emphasizes both transcendence and immanence, allowing for multiplicity within unity. What appears restrictive from one perspective may appear coherent within another. Understanding these distinct views on worship helps clarify why each tradition responds differently to the idea of worshiping someone else. In Islam, it contradicts the very nature of God's oneness. In many Hindu traditions, diverse worship can still align with ultimate unity. The difference lies not in generosity or ego, but in the foundational understanding of who or what the divine is. When people describe Allah as egoistic or Bhagwan as large-hearted, these judgments often arise from comparing two different theological systems without fully understanding their internal logic. Such labels are usually emotional reactions rather than conclusions reached through careful study. What may seem strict or severe within one worldview can appear consistent and necessary when examined within its own framework. Likewise, what seems open and expansive in another tradition reflects its own philosophical foundations, rather than a contrast in divine personality. In Islam, the idea that worship must be directed exclusively to Allah flows directly from the concept of Tawheed. The Quran presents God as absolutely one, unique and incomparable. Within that framework, associating partners with God is not simply a minor theological difference, but a contradiction of ultimate reality. The seriousness attached to this belief is therefore tied to truth and justice as defined in Islam. From inside this system, exclusivity is not a sign of insecurity or ego, but a reflection of divine uniqueness. In contrast, many Hindu traditions operate within a philosophical structure that accommodates diversity of form and approach. The Bhagavad Gita expresses a vision in which the divine can be approached through multiple paths, and different forms of worship can ultimately lead to the same supreme reality. Within this worldview, plurality does not threaten unity, it expresses it. As a result, flexibility in devotion is seen as natural rather than contradictory. When these two systems are placed side by side without context, misunderstandings easily arise. A person raised in a pluralistic tradition may perceive Islamic exclusivity as harsh. Conversely, someone grounded in strict monotheism may perceive theological plurality as inconsistent. Both reactions stem from evaluating one belief system through the lens of another. It is also important to recognize that theological language often uses human terms to describe divine realities, but those terms do not always carry the same meaning when applied to God. Words like jealous, merciful, or just may appear similar across religions, yet their philosophical implications differ significantly. Assigning human emotional traits, such as ego, to the divine oversimplifies complex theological doctrines. Ultimately, the question is not about which God has a bigger heart or a stricter temperament. It is about how each tradition understands ultimate reality, human purpose, and spiritual responsibility. Once we understand that Islam and Hinduism are built upon different metaphysical assumptions, the comparison shifts. Instead of seeing contradiction in terms of personality, we begin to see coherence within each faith's own structure. Recognizing these differences encourages respectful dialogue rather than judgment. It allows us to move beyond surface level labels and toward deeper understanding.